have a great interview on the Young Turks here for you guys now. It's with Reza Aslan. He is a professor and a scholar, obviously, of the Middle East and of religion. His last book, No God But God, The Origins, Evolution, and Future of Islam, was only considered one of the most important, 100 most important books of the last decade. And so, of course, when he went on Fox News to talk about his new book, Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth, they tried to disqualify him because he happens to be Muslim. So that was an awesome moment. Reza, great to have you here with us on the Young Turks.
Thanks for having me.
On the Fox News stuff, I don't want to spend too much time on it, and I actually want to come back to it for a variation of it that I have at the end.
Yeah.
But I really, really want to talk to you about your book. Because I'm curious, and I've always been curious about the actual historical life of Jesus and whether it even existed. Now, I've seen some things where they made an interesting argument, let's put it that way, that he was actually a combination of different mythical characters, and there could be a case that he never even existed. So can you put that aside for me as definitively not true?
I think that most scholars would agree that there was a man named Jesus who existed in the first third of the first century A.D. We have, outside of the New Testament, very little information about him, but we do have just kind of a throwaway mention of him written by a Jewish historian named Flavius Josephus in around 94 CE, which is remarkable that anyone would have written about this marginal Jewish peasant. So I think most scholars would say, yes, this man named Jesus of Nazareth existed, but what he said and what he meant, that's all up for debate.
So I've always been tripped out by that, for lack of better phraseology, that the Bible was written so many years after Jesus' life. So how in the world could they have known what he said, given that people weren't writing things down back then? So how did that work?
Yeah, I mean, we have this tendency to think of the Gospels as though they were some kind of eyewitness accounts of Jesus' actions, as though like Matthew, Mark, and Luke were walking around with like a pencil and a piece of paper writing down everything that Jesus said. And of course, that's not the case at all. These were testimonies of faith written by communities of faith many years after the events that they described. The first Gospel, Mark, was probably written around 70, 71 A.D., so about 40 years after Jesus died. The last Gospel, John, could have been written anywhere between 100 and 120 A.D. And it's also important to understand that these aren't exactly historical documents in the way that we think about them. I mean, the Gospel writers already believed that Jesus was the Messiah or the Son of God or God himself, and then they wrote these Gospels to prove that belief. And so, in a sense, while they're enormously important and valuable for a whole host of reasons, and yes, we can get a little bit of a kernel of historicity out of them, they're not historical documents. They don't really tell us that much about the actual person who walked the earth 2,000 years ago.
You know, as a non-Christian, when I first found out that the Gospels were not written by the apostles, I almost couldn't believe it. And I bet you that a great majority of Christians don't even know that.
Right.
And since it's not the 12 dudes who were hanging out with them, but guys who wrote 40 to 120 years later,
right,
then that makes me going back to thinking, nah, even if he existed, who cares? They made up all the stuff.
Well, made up is the wrong way to think about it. I mean, look, what you and I call history, the accumulation of facts and dates that are empirically verifiable, is totally a product of the modern age. I mean, that definition of history is like 300 years old at most. The ancient mind would have no idea what you mean when you talk that way. They were not interested in revealing facts. They were interested in revealing truths. So you don't want to think about the Gospels as false. That's the wrong way to think about it, because they wouldn't even understand what you mean. The Gospels are true in the sense that they are meant to impart a deeper truth about who they believed this man was. But insofar as they were trying to sort of write down an objective history of Jesus' words and actions, they wouldn't even know what you mean by that term.
All right, but you're a historian and a scholar, and as such, do you believe that Jesus actually said the things that are in the Gospels, or do you believe those are the things that they either wished he had said or thought, well, you know, these are things that would be convenient if Jesus had said it? or maybe even thought, hey, I think Jesus said it. I'm not really sure, but it'd be lovely if he did.
Let me give you a perfect metaphor to understand how to read the Gospels and how they were actually written. So again, this is not about revealing facts, it's about revealing truths. What you want to do is say something true about a person by putting it in the guise of a story. That's what the Gospels are. That's how the ancient mind understood these kinds of quote-unquote historical writings. So if I wanted to say something about some guy named Joe I wanted to say that he's a really giving and compassionate person, this is what I would say. One day, Joe walked outside. It was freezing cold. He saw a homeless man on the street without a shirt on, so he took off his own shirt and gave it to the homeless man and walked on. Now, did Joe actually do that? Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. But the question is irrelevant to the ancient mind because you missed the entire point of the story. The point of the story is that Joe is the kind of guy who would take his shirt off of his own back and give it to you. That's how the Gospels were written. You begin with a fundamental truth about Jesus, that he is the anointed one, the Messiah, later on that he is God incarnate. And then you write stories whose underlying truth is to prove that notion, but whose facts are just sort of secondary, not relevant. Now, as a historian, we can go in and we can there are little tricks that we can play to figure out what's more likely historically accurate and what's less likely historically accurate. But all in all, you're dealing with something called sacred history, which I've said this 4 times, and I'm going to say it a 5th time because it's such a hard thing for people to get their minds around, which is based on revealing truth, not facts.
All right, that's awesome. As an agnostic, my perspective on it is, yeah, not buying it.
And that's fine. That's perfectly fine, yeah.
From my perspective as a non-believer, I look at that and I think, okay, so there are no facts. And since it's quote-unquote sacred history, it's actually different than real history. In other words, it's not necessarily history. So, I mean, you can say that's biased on my part, but it's hard for an objective person who doesn't believe to see it any differently.
Right, but remember, you keep using this word history as though we all agree what it is. The word history that you just used is only 300 years old. So they would say that this is as true as you would say a history of Napoleon is true. But they're different characters, of course. And again, it's all about making sure that you take the claims of the Gospels and you look at them in light of what we know about the world in which Jesus lived. And while it's true that we know very little about Jesus himself outside of what's written about him in the Gospels, we know a lot about Jesus' world. And that's the whole point of this book, is that you take what little we know about Jesus, that he was a Jew, that he started a Jewish movement, and that he was ultimately arrested as a state criminal and crucified for that movement. You take those 3 things, you put it in this world that we know so much about because of the Roman occupation. The Romans, it turns out, were pretty good at documentation. And all of a sudden, a picture arises of this man that, well, frankly, bears little resemblance to the picture of the kind of gentle shepherd who turns the other cheek, who's an inveterate pacifist with no care for this world, whose kingdom is of another world. That Jesus, frankly, would have gone unnoticed in 1st century Palestine.
So, all right, let's put aside the fact that, from my interpretation of what you're saying, is that the guys who wrote the Gospels could have written it about Jesus, could have written it about Bob. Okay, they just picked a name out of a hat of all the different messiahs and said, okay, these are my sacred history that I would like to believe. Okay, put that aside for a second, and I understand what you're saying about that, and I think the audience is clear about what I'm saying on it. When you look at the actual history of Jesus himself, what do we know other than he's Jewish, he's got 12 guys following him around? What else do we know?
Well, by the way, he had a lot more than 12 guys following him around. He had a whole host of men and women who followed him around. But of that group of disciples, 12 of them were special, and they were called the apostles. What we know about Jesus is that he was a poor, illiterate, uneducated peasant who lived in the low hills of Galilee. In other words, he was a nobody. And that's remarkable because what's amazing to think about is that despite this lack of education, lack of access, despite being at the lowest rung of the social ladder in his time and place, he was nevertheless, through his charisma and through the power of his teachings, able to form this movement that was seen as such a threat to the religious and political authorities of his time that he was ultimately arrested, tortured, and executed for it. To me, it doesn't matter who you think Jesus is. You could think he's God, you could think he's a man, you could think that he doesn't exist if you want to. But if I told you that story about anyone, call him Bob, about this poor illiterate peasant whose movement was so profound and so threatening that he was arrested as a state criminal, that's an interesting guy. That's a guy I want to know more about. And that's what really led me to write this book, because, Jesus is obviously, one of the most pivotal human beings in history. He launched the largest religion in the history of the world. But beyond that, just the basic facts of his story are so compelling that, again, regardless of what you think of him, this is a story worth knowing.
So on the issue of a threat to the state, how common was it for these messiahs, you say that there were plenty of them around back then in Palestine, to be significant enough to be a threat to the state to merit crucifixion? Was that something common, or was it something really rare?
It was actually quite common. We know the names of about a dozen or so other messiahs besides Jesus. Some of them are mentioned in the New Testament. Many of them were actually far more successful in their lifetimes than Jesus was, had way more followers than Jesus did. But if we know the names of 12 of them, you can probably guess that there were 10 times as many that we don't know about. This was an era that was awash in apocalyptic expectation. People really believed that the Roman occupation was something that was an abomination to God. And so one after another, these preachers and prophets and messiahs and bandits and miracle workers showed up promising deliverance from Rome, and every single one of them was killed for doing so. You have to understand that in first century Palestine, simply saying the words, "I am the Messiah," is a treasonable offense. The Messiah means the anointed one. The job of the Messiah is, as the descendant of King David, to recreate David's kingdom on earth, to usher in God's rule on earth. Well, if you're saying to people that I am here to usher in God's rule on earth, what you're saying is that I'm here to usher out Caesar's rule on earth. That's a treasonable offense, and many, many of Jesus' fellow messiahs learned the cost of that kind of sedition, just as he did.
Based on the facts that you're telling me, my interpretation of those facts is, yeah, they picked his name out of a hat, and he was just a lunatic wandering around like many other lunatics at the time. So let me go to that question. Is there any reason to believe this particular so-called Messiah, Jesus, believed he was the Son of God and all the other things that have been attributed to him?
Well, let's just get one thing clear here. Son of God is not a description in the Bible, it's a title. Many, many people are called Son of God in the Bible. It's actually a common title. It's a title that you give to kings. So if Jesus ever actually did refer to himself as the Son of God, he meant he was king. Nobody in Jesus' time would have understood that to mean the literally begotten Son of God. That is, the way that became a description instead of a title happened long, long after Jesus' death. But to your larger question, why is it that there were all these other messiahs, and only one of them 2,000 years later is still called Messiah, and we've forgotten about all those other ones? That's a very good question. That's precisely what the book tries to answer. And frankly, the truth of the matter is that it had less to do with anything Jesus himself said or did, though what he said or did was remarkable. It had more to do with what his followers said about him, and the fact that what they did was begin to transform this movement, this deeply Jewish movement, the purpose of which was to free the Jews from the Roman occupation, into a kind of Roman religion. I mean, just the very fact that you're talking about, the idea that Jesus, thought of himself as God. The notion of a God-man is anathema to everything Judaism has ever said about God. If Jesus was a Jew, he would have never called himself God, no one would have even understood what he meant by calling himself God, because it violates 5,000 years of Jewish tradition, scripture, and thought. But you know who's pretty comfortable with the idea of a God-man? The Romans. I mean, Caesar was a God-man. That's not all that weird of a thing. And so in by the third or fourth generation of Jesus' followers, as this movement stops being a Jewish movement and starts being a Roman movement, these ideas about Jesus as God incarnate begin to kind of solidify, and Christianity as we know it comes to fruition.
I'm amused by the idea that 2,000 years ago, they wouldn't believe things as outrageous as, having known almost nothing about science back then, things that are so outrageous, but yet we believe them today. Like if we told them, oh, he's God or the Son of God, they'd be like, come on, man, you're crazy.
Well, but only because, I mean, again, the Persians would not have had a problem with that belief. The Egyptians wouldn't have a problem with it. The Greeks and the Romans wouldn't have a problem with it, but the Jews would. The Jews would not have understood what God-man means. Other people at the time would have gotten it.
All right, one last question for you, Reza. And I'm going to border on Fox News-ish here, and this is what I meant by coming back to that issue. Now, again, from my perspective, I'm agnostic. I'm a non-believer. I find all of this stuff wonderful and fanciful and fascinating. But as a historian and a scholar, as you read all of this, how can you still believe any of these religions?
I don't believe in a religion. I believe in God. The only reason that I call myself a Muslim is because the symbols and metaphors that Islam uses to talk about God are ones that I like, the ones that make sense to me. It's not like Islam is more true than Christianity or Christianity is more true than Judaism. They are all equally true, equally valid ways of expressing what is absolutely inexpressible. If you believe that there is something beyond the material world, that there is something that is truly transcendent, then you need some kind of language to talk about it, to make sense of it. That's all that religion is. Anyone who says, I believe in Christianity or I believe in Islam misses the point. Christianity and Islam are not things to believe. They are signposts to God. They are a means to an end, not an end in of themselves.
That's wonderfully ironic, because my mom is the exact opposite and the exact same as you. She says, I don't want to know what's in the Quran, right? Because we grew up Muslim, she's Muslim, right? She said, I don't want to know what's in the Quran. All I know is that I believe. So what you're saying is, I know what's in the Quran. And all I know is I just want to believe.
Look, it's a simple proposition. You either believe that there's something beyond the material world or you do not. If you do not, fine. If you do, then do you want to actually experience it, commune with it, or do you not? If you do not, fine. If you do, then you need some help. You need a way to express what is fundamentally undefinable. And that's all religion does. It gives you a language to express it. Anything more than that, and you're missing the point of what religion is. The great Christian mystic Meister Eckhart once said, if you focus too narrowly on a single path to God, all you will ever find is the path.
Oh, that's really interesting. Dr. Reza Aslan, the book is Zealot, The Life and Times of Jesus of Nazareth. And the one thing you cannot argue is that it's an interesting book. Thank you so much for joining us. Really
My
appreciate
pleasure.
it.
Thanks for having me.